So I see some from outside the residency. So let me explain just a little about our residency first. I'm Dr. Kanai Minowa. And I and my team is currently conducting the campus artist in residence. It's almost closing now. Then we did lots of programs and events as well. Then this artist talk as well, one of the program in this residency. Then we are going to the residency. The open studio in the residency will be ended on next Monday, but after that we are going to prepare our exhibition. So exhibition at the University of Tsukuba, but we are going to prepare the virtual gallery as well. So outside the Tsukuba University of Tsukuba also can participate and visit our exhibition. So please, we are very happy if you could visit our exhibition. So now my explanation has finished.
Okay, thank you, Kane. I'm just going to share my screen, and what I thought, morning everybody, well, evening everybody, sorry, I forget. It's a nice Friday evening for you, and it's a nice early Friday morning for me. So it's lovely that you've come along to this session. I promise not to talk too long. I've got a series of slides and some films that I'd like to show. Should speak for about 20 minutes, and then really what I'm really interested in is the second bit, where we get a chance to ask some questions, where you can ask me about pretty much anything to do with the exhibition. So we'll talk a little bit about the exhibition. As I said, I'll show the films, and then we have a chance to sort of ask questions. If you want to use the chat, feel free as we go along to put questions in the chat. And if you don't feel confident in writing in English, then I totally understand. Dr. Manawa has very kindly agreed to act as interpreter. And so if you wanted to ask something, then she could translate, and she'll keep an eye on the chat with questions, so that we've got hopefully an opportunity to make clear for everybody, and hopefully give everybody a chance to have a think about what I've been doing, and a chance to think about the work that I've been producing, and the understandings that are evident within that sort of within that work. So let's make a start. First thing I want to do is just, as I say, thank to Dr. Manawa, and obviously for inviting me back this year to contribute to the Campus Artist in Residence 21, 10 days. I'd also like to thank the T+ Gallery and obviously the University of Tsukuba for hosting and allowing me to show again. And this year has only been possible due to the support of people on the ground. And obviously Dr. Manawa and her team has been really key, because I can't be there to install, I can't be there to set up. So it's been really important. And so I just want to say thank you to everybody that's made that possible. So just a quick sort of introduction. So I live in London and in Brighton, and I teach at UCL, and my studio is in Brighton in a place called Portslade. I belong to, Portslade is like a an industrial sort of harbour. It's a fishing port just a little bit along the coast from Brighton. And I belong to a cooperative, an artists cooperative called Red Herring. I teach mainly PGCE, which is initial teacher education, art and design secondary. And I also teach on the MA in museums and galleries and the MA in art and design education. So across, if you want, programs across sort of levels and, you know, as well as, and internationally as well. And I think there are two interwoven strands to my practice as an artist, as a researcher, and as a teacher. One, it's art education, visual art practice as research, and particularly importantly, making. And then two, transdisciplinarity, the idea of collaboration and a dialogue in approach. And that's why I'm here today, because that's really important to me, that idea of a dialogue, a conversation about my making. So my artistic practice includes sculpture. My first degree was in fine art sculpture, but also film. And I'm going to show films and look at films today. Objects, drawings, prints, and are usually kind of installation based, sort of in situ or in a context. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that before we talk about the films, because I think some of the things I did last year will help give a background understanding. Yeah, and I think that idea of collaboration, that idea of working as an artist, a researcher, and a teacher, and bringing these kinds of things together in a gallery context are important. It's a way of me of being able to make sense of what I do and how I do it, but also it helps me with understanding. It helps me with knowledge generation. It helps me with, well, meaning making. And there's been a number of artists that have helped me over time with my approach and the way that I work. People like John Baldessari, Joseph Beuys, Richard Serra, Tacita Dean, and perhaps Bruce Nauman, all sort of conceptual artists who all sort of articulate and think about that relationship between making, ways of seeing and being and learning, a kind of an inquiry-based sort of approach. So maybe a little bit about last year and the T Plus Gallery and the space and the way that I used that as a conversation with people on the residency last year. So last year I used the space more of an installation, and the title, as you can see in the top right hand corner, was the art of walking. The idea of combining my responses in situ in an installation in the space, kind of my response to a lot of the recent walking that I'd been doing and thinking whilst on the South Downs in England. And so the exhibition was really a kind of a collection of works which investigates the relationship between the brain, the body, the soul, and art making, a kind of dialogue with myself whilst physically engaging in walking. And I did this through a series of prints, sculptures, objects, and I used the space to ask questions about time, questions about place, and a little bit about the consciousness, my consciousness of art and the art world, as well as that kind of momentum of putting one foot in front of the other, you know, in a journey while I'm walking. And I think I was kind of, in that installation, inviting people to sort of walk in my shoes, consider the idea of lines, footprints, writing, intimate reflections, the inner and outer landscapes, the soul, and a kind of an interplay between the body, the mind, and the world. And the reason why I mention that now is because some of those themes come up in the more recent work that's presently being shown in the gallery, and some of those things kind of have been developed slightly differently through the medium of film. So I think last year there were several reoccurring themes that I think are quite interesting. That about the idea of me being a conceptual artist and the idea being important, the issues, the idea of a process and the journey. That kind of makes sense again. The next theme, I think, is kind of embodiment, about how we know through the body, how the relationship between the mind, thinking, the body, the physical, the feeling, and the soul, the emotional. I think these come through again in the films, and they were very evident in the previous installation, and how we learn, how we understand via these experiences, how we use the environment you're in, and the way that the body moves through these spaces, and the way that you make sense in a bodily way. I think that kind of resonates again in sort of the films. I mean, recently, I've in the past and more recently, I did a lot of work that's about the brain, and it's about my relationship to the brain, and about sort of perception and my understandings through these different sort of types of perception, different sorts of observations about how I perceive and see. And and I'm interested in that that relationship that we have with our brains and our sort of perceptions. I mean, I suffer with dyslexia, and so my brain is kind of slightly wired differently. And I've been thinking about that. I've been thinking about the effects, and I've been thinking about the impacts on my creative process, and using my senses as a way of being able to understand things, even though I kind of have a brain that's slightly works slightly differently. And when I talk about the senses, I think more than just the classical senses of perhaps touch or sight or hearing and taste. I'm interested in the kind of interrelationship that happens between these senses, and how we perceive through a range of senses, how the senses collaborate together to help understanding. And the other kind of theme that resonates across from last year to this year is the idea of an installation, creating an atmosphere, creating a space. And on this occasion, it's a visual sort of a technological video sort of space, the idea of movement, the idea of perhaps performance and drawing. So all of these things kind of, I think, cross over. I think a lot of these things are kind of evident in last year, in last year and in this year. And I think I'm pondering on that kind of development from last year to this year. And I think that's kind of something that I just wanted to flag first. But let's look at this year's work. So here we have the T Plus Gallery from the outside. A little health warning. These are new pieces. They're still, I think I'm still trying to make sense of things, and some of the significance of some of these things. So please bear that in mind. I might not be totally clear sometimes about all aspects, because I think they're kind of still in process, still in progress. But I don't mind that. I think it's important. I don't feel the need that everything has to be sort of, finely polished, before you start showing and talking about things. I think sometimes it's quite nice to show things at the stage that they might be in. And I have a sense that some of these aren't quite fully formed, but I don't think that really matters. I think they're kind of, as I said, linking some of the conceptual ideas from last exhibition, but there's definitely some developments which really I want to sort of flag. And I think some of the questions may be, at the end here, may be around that. I'm thinking more about the possibilities of outside the gallery on this occasion, rather than the inside like I was last year. And for obvious reasons. Obviously, the context is very different this year. COVID means that we're not allowed to be in spaces in the same way that we used to be able to be. There's issues about, being in contact with people, etc. So I kind of started the thinking about how to install and curate these based around those sort of challenges. So what you see are the pieces that I've curated in the window of the T Plus Gallery. There are 4 windows, each with a different film being shown on the monitor, all at the same height, all on a white plinth, with the background of the gallery concealed by a curtain that runs from ceiling to floor the entire length of the window. So you can't see in. You can't see into the gallery space. The gallery space is blocked out from your vision. So that's kind of an interesting sort of shift from previous last year to this year. You're not allowed to, you're not allowed to, go in. You're not allowed to sort of even see in, which I think is interesting. The screens are about 24 inches in size and are placed one per window. So they're little frames within frames, which again is something that's kind of interesting to think about. And because they're in the window and they're quite close to the window, you can sort of have quite you can get quite close up to them and you can be quite intimate, but you can also see them at a distance. You can also walk away and you can see all four working simultaneously. You can see them all playing at the same time. A little picture there of Hina and Ayana, who helped with the install. So thank you very much once again for all of your kindness in helping put this together. Oh, yeah, there we go. Yeah, there's the picture. So they're not synced, the films, but they do run concurrently. So each film is a slightly different length. They're 20 seconds to about 80 seconds, but they're on a loop. So they're continually playing and they're continually sort of starting up, having gone through a cycle. And as a viewer under, sort of COVID instructions, I think that's kind of nice because you can kind of go and see these. You're outside and you're looking in. You're able to look at one at a time, or you're able to look at them all together. Again, which I think is a kind of a nice element to this particular arrangement. And the other thing that's nice to note and to think about is that they are playing 24/7. They are playing all day. They've been playing constantly since Sunday, and they will be switched off at the end tomorrow morning, I think, or the end of today. I'm not sure when the destall is happening. So what's quite nice about that is that you can come across them at different points in the day and have slightly different kinds of views of them, different types of perspectives of them. So if you come across them at night, like you see here, in the image you can see now, you can see them across the courtyard. You can see them sort of flickering, moving in the dark. And because they are kind of completely blacked out, they seem to be floating in the distance, which I think is quite nice. And as you walk towards, you get different understandings as the relationship between you and them, as you get closer, you get different perspectives. And so that's something that's kind of resonates a little bit with the previous exhibition last year, and the idea of how when you're walking, you kind of approach things, or as you're walking away from things, you have different sorts of relationships with the objects or with the landscape as you are walking. And because walking is kind of a methodical sort of slow pace, I think it gives you time to look as you approach. And there's an element of that here. I like the idea that as you walk towards these pieces, and certainly at night, you kind of see different things. You'll see them as a collective, as a group, but you then start to focus on individual things. You may focus on one particular film, or you may focus on some of the relationships that are happening at the same time, how randomly they may be playing similar or maybe playing different kinds of patterns and sequences. So I quite like the idea of them floating, these floating hands, these floating images, which you can clearly see at night, where everything else is kind of blackened out. But as I said, you can also get close up, and because they are black and white films, there is no sound. There's just this constant cycle of grasping hands on each screen, conducting a slightly different task, but all trying to catch something. So that's the kind of the metaphor in the title, the idea of hands catching perceptions. And each one of these is trying to catch one particular object, or is manipulating and playing with the idea of one hand trying to catch. So this is the gallery statement, which goes up, and which I think is a nice introduction to the films. I'm just going to play the films in a moment for you. And I think it's kind of useful because it sort of gives a breakdown, a more of a literal sort of breakdown of what some of the things are happening. So this is, as I say in the introduction, 4 black and white films made in my studio. So that's something that, again, is quite interesting. So that I've had to strip out the studio, make the studio as kind of blank as possible, so that I can, so that I can actually engage in the sort of process. They're shown, as I say, the first time they've been shown publicly, but each one starts in exactly the same way. It starts with like a tightly shot frame of my right hand. And the process, as I say, is around the idea of my studio environment, the materials, objects, and tools that I'm using as a stimuli to explore some of those conceptual ideas around sensory properties and around elements of some of my artistic process, which I touched upon in that kind of contextual introduction. And they are, in some respects, they are a little bit like performances, or performances with hands, but maybe that's something I can, think about a bit more if people wanted to. So, as I said, there's four films: hands catching pencil, hands catching pots, hands catching rules. Here we see my hands sort of grasping the different objects, and methodically and repeatedly, I'm attempting to try and grab the object. And sometimes, I'm successful, but more often I'm failing. More often I completely miss, or more often it escapes me, and more often than not, I am unsuccessful. And so I think those, even when the moments when I am successful, they're very brief, before I then sort of move on, drop the object and start the cycle again. And I would argue that these kind of concepts about the idea of repetition, the sort of hypnotic nature, fleeting nature of these kinds of moments, these hit and miss moments, the struggle. These are interesting aspects about my creative process, which I think I'm trying to sort of visualize during the films. The fourth film, which is on the far right-hand side, hands breaking rules, is slightly different. On this occasion, the actions are different. I'm not trying to catch. What I'm trying to do here is bend and flex and manipulate sort of materials to their limits, to the boundaries of their properties. And I think here what you see is my hand physically trying to navigate around the medium and the action, physically sort of dealing with the tension and the resistance of the material, while still trying to get a good position, to lever, to sort of get some sort of edge on the material. And this takes, this is quite straining and increasingly more frustrating. And you can see that in the actions. The momentum is kind of different to the other three's momentum. And, and in some respects, I think this one's kind of different because it has a sense of an end, where the other three don't have a sense that they're ending. There's no kind of purpose in that respect, whereas this one seems to have a purpose, but then there's a contradiction, because for me, it's like an anticlimax. You get to the point, you expect to get to that point of breaking. It's not really a surprise, and so it becomes like a non-event, I suppose, which is what I was thinking about here in this kind of this kind of relationship. Okay, so I'm gonna now show the films. So let me just flick that out the way, and so I'll just play the films and talk over the top as we show them. They're quite short. I think that's quite nice. So they literally range from 20 seconds to about, as I say, 70, 80 seconds. They start from the left-hand side, catching pencils, catching pots, catching souls, and then breaking rules from left to right on the the gallery windows. And as I say, because they're looped, they are endless. Yeah, and what I'll perhaps do is through the showing of the films, I'll just make a few suggestions of themes and concepts about meaning making that perhaps people might want to ask a little bit more about. Yeah, they all start the same, with my right hand in the center, sort of opening and waiting, sort of reaching out into the screen, but sort of compressed and tightly kind of framed by the screen. So that's something that I think I've been thinking about in relationship to film and how I work with film. And there's lots of cycles, which I think again are a part of that. Again, maybe people might want to ask me questions about that. So I'm just going to stop sharing, and I'm just going to load up the films. So please bear with me while I just flick around screens. I want to pull that one to the fore, and now I want to share again. So the first one I'm going to show is, here we go, that one. Where is it? That one. Okay, can you see that okay? Is that on the screen? Okay, thumbs up. Thank you. Now let's. So, okay, what we've got here is Catching Pencils. I'm interested, as I mentioned, one of the sort of things that, one of the parts of the processes of my work is drawing. And I've been thinking a lot about my drawing, mainly because I'm not very confident in drawing. I don't think I'm that good at drawing. And because I trained as a sculptor, I think I draw in a way that's kind of, it's an odd statement to say, but I think I draw like a sculptor. I don't draw like a painter. I don't draw like people that relate to two dimensions more as a part of their practice. I think there's all sorts of assumptions there about why I draw and the kinds of qualities of drawing. And I think one of the things that I'm trying to think about here is my relationship to drawing is quite a physical relationship. I'm interested in the physical nature of drawing and the sculptural qualities that I bring into drawing. And I'm thinking very much about the material when I draw, and I'm very much interested in, the form and the, rather than two-dimensional sort of drawing, which is about, decorative or illusional. I'm more interested in, those kind of other relationships. And so here, this is quite interesting how, the film kind of gives me a sense that sometimes I'm successful, but not fully successful in thinking about my relationship to kind of drawing. Okay, so I'm going to stop that one. I'm going to now show the second, share the second show the second one. If I can, yes, this one this time. Okay, Canny, is that clear? Is that okay? Okay. Oh no, that's the wrong one. That's the same one. Sorry, I don't want that one. Apologies. It should have been that one. Okay. No, why does it keep doing the same one? Okay, I'm going to start. Okay. So what I'm going to do just is stop that one. That's what I want. Yeah. Okay. So this time, third time lucky. Let's see. Yes. Okay. This was, yeah. So this one is catching pots. So objects are an important part of my work. Sometimes I make objects, sometimes I use found objects, and so in this one I'm kind of thinking about that relationship between the sort of found and the things that I make. I've deliberately used pots. These are ceramic pots, vessels, because again, I think there's a nice metaphor there about the idea of a vessel. And I think there's something quite nice there about that idea of empty vessels, and the idea about thinking about learning and that relationship between me as an artist and an artist teacher. It's a kind of an old sort of concept of that I suppose I'm trying to sort of challenge as an idea of learners. There's something also quite nice about this as well, because we know that they are vessels, ceramic, and we know that the moment that they've passed by my hands, that they're going to be smashed, that they're falling to the floor. And there's something quite interesting there about that. Even though we can't hear it, we know that each one that gets past me is broken. So there's something quite interesting there about only once, like then, do I catch the the vessel. The rest of the time they're smashed, they're broken, they're ended in that sort of cycle. So that's something that I'm interested in thinking about there. But again, I think this is all about those kind of physical qualities. In having an object and using my hands gives me opportunities to, make sense of properties that you can't through drawing. So for instance, weight, I can feel weight. You can see my hand when I catch, actually kind of gives slightly as I've caught, under the weight. There's things there about the shape, the awkwardness of shapes and the relationship to the hand. But there's also things like the qualities. You can feel texture. You can feel the temperature of the material. So there's something there that I'm sort of thinking about with this one that's kind of a part of that sort of relationship between the hand and the object. Okay, I'm going to show the number 3, and what I will do is shut that down so that we don't get, okay, so okay, so number 3 is hands catching souls. He says, hopefully. Yeah. Oh, I look at this. Hey, something's actually working. Who says I can't learn about technology? So, so the metaphor here is kind of picking up deliberately on that relationship to the art of walking and the work that I've done with two elements, language and also the walking. As I mentioned, I'm dyslexic, and so certain words are kind of tricky for me. And so I'm sort of playing with the idea that in the UK, the word soul has 2 sort of meanings. It's spelt differently, but it has 2 meanings. One means the kind of the base of your shoe, the leather sort of part underneath the shoe. And the other one means, and internally it's referring to the spirit, the inside, your physical kind of, your kind of, your bodily kind of interior, your relationship to your understanding of your spirit. And so there's kind of I play with the language on a number of occasions, the sort of the different meanings in the different the relationships. And I've done a lot of work that's thinking about language, that's about body, that's about the heart, the gut, the lungs, and the soul. That way of thinking about how these things make sense of the world, how these different aspects of our understanding create a kind of a whole, understanding. Or a more rounded understanding of our experiences. Okay, and so I'll go to the last, I'll just show the last film, and then we can stop. And so he says, where is the last film? Did I open the last film? I think I did. So where are you? Okay, just give me a second. I'm just going to have to find it. Yeah. Okay, so I found the last film. And so this one's slightly different, as I said, out of the other three are very much a catching experience. They're very much about that kind of relationship. So this one, Breaking Rules, is slightly longer and in its length, and in some respects plays a very different plays with a very different ideas of my relationship between hands and making. And this one is, literally, as you can see, I'm sort of playing with the plastic. I'm exploring the plastic. I'm trying to think about the plastic as well as manipulate the plastic. And in many ways, I'm testing out the boundaries. I'm deliberately trying to see what it will do. How far can I take this? How far can I push this material before it obviously starts to change under my manipulation, or how it starts to become slightly different entity. What's interesting about this is it's quite childish in many respects. It's something I remember doing at school, challenging the ruler. The plastic ruler is a kind of typical object in your pencil case when you're at school. And I remember getting my very first shatterproof ruler and thinking, is it really shatterproof? Can I break this ruler? And that idea, even as a young child, that there's this need to just see how far I can take it before it breaks. So there's an inevitability about this. There's a predictable, it's going to eventually break, but you don't know when, at what point it breaks. You don't know how far I've got to push it before it breaks. And I think there's something kind of I'm trying to work through here, this idea of also the language. There's an interplay between in English, the meaning of a rule is, it could be like this, a physical plastic kind of measuring device, or a rule as in something that's laid down in terms of a law that tells us what we can and can't do. So it's that kind of idea that metaphorically this plastic ruler is also playing that playing on that notion that artists are not just physically manipulating rules, but might be deliberately exploring possibilities or thinking about breaking rules in another kind of way. So I think this is quite interesting. I think my hands get kind of tired here in this one more quickly, which is also kind of interesting. And there's kind of a reflection there of the inevitability and the predictability of some of those kinds of aspects. Okay, so I'm gonna stop sharing now, and maybe just have a little think about some of the themes that people might want to kind of ask a little bit more about. I think there's those images sort of generate sort of kind of a, for me, yeah, I mean, they generate for me a kind of a number of kind of areas that that cross over. I'm interested in hands because I think hands are have reoccurred as a theme for me for over time. There's lots of kind of meanings with regards to significance, with regards to sort of hands, hands reaching out, hands of friendship, joining hands. There's lots of positive symbolic kinds of meanings and understandings about hands. But on these, they're a little bit sort of OCD. There's lots of repetition, which again is a part of sort of something to do with my brain and that sort of obsessive sort of feature of my relationship to hands. And maybe this relationship to making as well sometimes is a little bit sort of obsessive compulsive in that way. There's also the theme of hands handmade, the idea of the artist and the importance of the hand, and the challenge that, conceptually, sometimes we work away from the idea that there has to be the hand of the artist that's evident there, and the idea that actually sometimes you can't see the hand of the artist in the making process, and how some of my earlier works were very much evident, my hand was evident, but later on some of my work, it's kind of a mixture, and sometimes you can't see the hand of the artist evident in production and in making. So I think that's kind of a theme that runs through. And also with COVID, I think it's been very interesting to me that COVID, there's been a lot of focus on hands. It's almost like hands are being blamed for the transmission and the spreading of COVID. And there's a lot of concern about touch, and there's a lot of concern about, washing your hands, no shaking hands, don't touch, etc. So I think that's kind of interesting that I've sort of used hands to make those kinds of relationships and some of those kinds of understandings, because hands, in terms of perception, are kind of key for us in understanding. As I mentioned, my hands give me lots of information, lots of understandings about material, about sorts of the making. So I think that kind of comes through. There's things in there that about sort of, as I say, the influences in terms of film and some of the artists that have interest me. There's some themes in there about sort of that perception, the idea of that relationship between the hand, the eye, the body, knowing, the reoccurring inquiry. I mean, they look at times, look a little bit like almost like scientific experiments, which again is something that kind of interests me, the way that there is that kind of interplay between inquiry and exploration, and that relationship between how we find out, and some of the similarities in some processes of repeating and frequently going over to try to make sense, to understand. And then the other theme is kind of failure, the sort of reoccurring problem of missing and dropping and half catching and not really fully being clean in getting what I want, and the mistakes and how I learn and adapt from making mistakes. I think a lot of those kind of, those kinds of obsessive aspects come through, all in terms of relating to the hands and how they are conceiving and perceiving through observations. My understandings developed in that physical perception of the materials, but also in that cognitive kind of understanding, in the way that it's slightly intuitive, in the way that there is this kind of embodiment that links those experiences and relies on a kind of a sensory experience and stimulus in terms of knowing the properties, knowing the environment, and developing. Okay, I'm going to stop. That's enough. I think that's kind of given everybody enough about the about the kind of what was shown and what I've been sort of trying to achieve. I didn't know if anybody wants to perhaps pick up on any of those kind of aspects or any of those kind of things that they'd like to ask me about. Kane, can you chair? Is that okay?
Yeah. So you want me to call someone, or?
No. It's if people can't translate, or if people want to ask in Japanese and you can translate into English, if anybody wants to sort of explore any aspects, I suppose.
So now we are going to start question and answer session. So
or statements. People might want to make some statements rather than ask questions as well.
That's common.
Yeah.
So you can give him any question and comment. どなたか、 質問とか、コメントとかある方はチャットに書き込んでもらってもいいですし、直接聞いてもらっても大丈夫です。
Or not.
So could you please
I'm sure
answer?
some of the artists are dying to ask, you know, having spent the week with me asking lots of questions about about what they're doing and me asking them to explain things. I'm very happy to try and flip that sort of relationship, and if they want to ask me things, that's fine by me. Or if you're not confident to speak, you can always put a question in the chat if you're not confident to speak. Or not. Okay. Look, if there's no questions, Kenny, we don't have to force people to. I'm not going to torture people. Please feel free.
Hi, Andy. Sorry, I have a question, if that's all
Sure.
right.
Yeah, I can't see who it is. Hello.
Sorry, it's Alicia. Sorry, I haven't got my thing on because it's on my phone, my video. But I just was wondering about this idea. I'm looking at like skill, the word skill, and it was what came up quite regularly in it was the idea of repetition, with hands, like sort of skill-based practices, and the idea of repetition. But then sort of it melded into sort of practice and that idea and how they're sort of linked this through doing physical like use. And I just wondered, what was your sort of, when with these videos and with this sort of experiences, did you feel like at the end you were sort of moving forward in like building a skill with using your hands, or do you feel like it was very much not about, it was very much just sort of static, if that makes sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It is interesting, isn't it? Because when we talk about skills or techniques, we quite often think about craft. And when we talk about craft, we quite often talk about materials. And so that kind of relationship in making of materials and skills and techniques tends to sort of reside more in the field of craft. Now, for me, that's quite interesting because, you know, I think as a conceptual artist, I'm kind of sort of thinking about the fluid boundaries of some of these things and the tensions. You know, as I said, sometimes I do make, and sometimes I don't. You know, that relationship between the hand and the making is kind of not evident, but kind of is what I'm drawing attention to in the film about that sort of conversation about, well, you know, as an artist, do I have to, you know, have a skill that I am developing technically with material, or are the films kind of doing that but not doing that? You know, it's about that relationship between my perception and understanding of the creative process and my kind of yeah, dialogue with myself about these kinds of rules that other people make up. You know, if you think about certainly in schools, there is a kind of a hierarchy of what is called art, and what is called art in schools is quite often skills and techniques, and it's not really art, it's kind of craft. Even though it might be drawing, it's the craft of drawing. It's not really drawing. So I'm constantly sort of thinking about these kind of aspects and playing with these kinds of aspects. And so, yeah, I can see what you mean, that there's the conversation I'm having about repetition and developing my, I would say perception rather than skill, because I don't think yeah, I don't think I'm thinking about, in the films, I'm not thinking about skill in that sort of sense. I think when I'm drawing, I'm conscious of developing through repetition. And I think my drawing has got better, kind of, because of constant revisiting and constant sort of exploration and better understanding through repeating. So I get that. I understand how that kind of is part of the learning and my discovery and inquiry. So it's a little bit of a ramble there. I'm not quite sure if that helps, Osha, but I mean, yeah. I see exactly what you mean. I think it's definitely evident. I don't think I have an answer. But as more conceptually, I think that's what I'm what I'm perhaps drawing attention to. Do you want to respond to that? Does that make kind of sense for you?
No, definitely. It definitely makes sense. I think, yeah, I sort of agree. And I suppose it's that idea of the subconscious and the conscious, I think, of like the building, and how do we have to be consciously practicing to build, or can we, through sort of the subconscious, like repetition acts. But yeah, no, it is a big question, but thank you. No, it really did help, so thank you.
See, repetition is something that, when you think of developing quality, if you're a musician and you're thinking about your medium, your instruments, through repetition you refine. And I think there's and through repetition you kind of develop that kind of technique and skill and refine. I think there's an element of that in sort of what I'm thinking as well. I'm not quite sure about my skill, so that's quite interesting, because I feel quite as I say, I kind of lack confidence in many ways in certain aspects of thinking about skill and technique. But that doesn't, I don't think that worry. I don't, even though I lack confidence, I don't think it worries me. I think that's just kind of part of that sort of internal conversation that you have with yourself, isn't it, about what you think is good. And I think that's why I like the idea that I'm playing with the idea that I constantly fail as well as constantly achieve, because I think that's a key part of the learning of what I've been doing and the thinking. Yeah, if that kind of helps, then yeah.
Yeah, no, it definitely helps. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Hi, Andy.
Hello.
Hello. May I have a rather educational question?
Sure, go for it.
Because during this session, my feeling is like you're navigating us to know more about your art practice. You're navigating us to your meaning making process, how you bring your initial idea to a more complex process, or how you simultaneously develop your idea during your making. So do you think this can be achieved by the artwork per se, because it's kind of performance in itself, or do you think it's necessary to like deliver some artist teacher session, because I think it's not very common in Asia?
Yeah.
Thank you.
No, that's a really good question. Thank you. I mean, I started just sort of flagging that idea about my identity being sort of three things: as an artist, as a researcher, and as a teacher, and how, and perhaps what I didn't talk about is how they are synergized and how they coexist and work with each other to be a part of the entity as an artist. I mean, I think that kind of, for me, the process of dialogue and conversation and using the gallery space as a hosted space to have those kinds of conversations is important. It's important from my point of view, in terms of my understanding, the questions that are raised, the conversations that cross different sorts of disciplines and different members who turn up to want to ask is kind of important. It helps me with those different perspectives. But I think also from, and so we're on a residency at the moment. So that's what's quite interested in is I'm hosting and helping people over these 10 days, but using my own work as a way of having a conversation about making and meaning making. I'm using that to help the sort of the community, the group of artists understand a little bit about conceptual art and a little bit about my kind of processes. So in many respects, I think this is why it's important. I don't just show things. I think it's important that we kind of, I hold moments like this to discuss things, to help those kinds of understandings for the people who want to come and look and listen, and also for myself. I see it as a two-way process. So there is that kind of responsibility as an artist, as a collaborator, and I would say, as an educator, I talk about collaboration rather than teaching, because I think that's kind of important. The idea that knowledge is co-constructed, that it's a conversation that helps us develop understanding. So for me, there's a theoretical kind of position there about that relationship between the learning and the conversations and the approach, the pedagogical understanding, but then that feeds so much into how I work as an artist. So so the simple answer is, I think people will go and not have the conversation, and will take away different sorts of levels of engagement. But for me, this kind of forum of sharing is an important part of the meaning making for the audiences and for myself. So yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of operate. Does that answer does that make sense for you, Feng, in terms of those relationships of what how the viewer, the audience can work on levels or operate at different ways, if that makes sense?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you.
And I think I'm very conscious that this is, certainly there's a lot of language that's involved in this. So understanding conceptual art language is kind of important. And so I'm try to explain what I'm doing so that it's a little bit more kind of evident for those that perhaps don't engage in that kind of work. Okay. So it's getting close to 11 o'clock, Kenny. We said we'd stop at 11. So is there anything else that we'd perhaps like to, anybody waving or want to ask? I'm just going to end by just showing the last slide, which will be just to show you my contact details. Oh God, that wasn't very good, was it? Just going to show my contact details if anybody would like to, if anybody doesn't feel confident to ask now, please feel free to sort of contact me and ask. I'm very happy. Certainly, the artists who are on the residency, if they feel like there's something that I could help with, then please, as I say, feel free to contact me and use the email address at UCL. Or go to my website to look at some of the other work to help sort of make sense of some of those things that Fen was talking about, that relationship between the artist and the sort of researcher and the educator. Yeah, I think that's all I'd like to say, other than once again, thank you to Dr. Manawa, and obviously to the T+ Gallery, and obviously to University of Tsukuba for allowing us to do that this year. Thank you, Kane.
Yeah, you're welcome. So thank you for coming, all of you, this tonight or morning or whatever. So student in Tsukuba, please enjoy your last few days in the residency, and also people from outside Japan, China, or UK. So thank you very much for coming and listening.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for being so kind. Bye.